Hello, this video is going to cover Module 11 for Marine Biology. And this module is on coral reefs. So we'll look at a map in just a moment, but coral reefs are found in tropical areas because they do best where there are warm temperatures and where there is plenty of sunlight. So you'll see in the map that we look at that it's pretty much found, the coral reefs are pretty much found between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. So here's the Tropic of Cancer on the north side and the Tropic of Cancer here and the Tropic of Capricorn there. The equator would be right across the middle. So the purple area represents those areas where coral reefs can be found. So in order for a coral reef to grow, in order for the larva of a coral reef to grow, they need the larvae need a hard surface to grow on, and they also need shallow and clear water where light can penetrate so that photosynthesis can take place. So generally when we think about coral reefs, there are two aspects to it. There are the reef builders, and there are the reef inhabitants. So we'll talk about each of these. And we'll start with the reef builders. So these, obviously the reef builders are the ones who produce or make the reef. Most of these are tiny corals. And what these corals do is they produce calcium carbonate around their bodies. And so this calcium carbonate is the rock of a coral reef. Besides the coral, another organism that is important in terms of the reef builders is one that is called zooxanthellae. And this lives in symbiosis with coral. And by living in symbiosis with the coral, the zooxanthinae provides nutrients for the coral. And we're going to say a little bit more about xanthellae a little bit later. Coral, the xanthellae, and then another one that is involved in reef building is algae. And there's a particular type of algae that is called coralline algae. And this algae also produces, they also have calcium carbonate. So this algae grows around the coral, and it provides another layer of protection for the coral. So that if waves, it provides protection against waves. This algae also helps to trap like fine sediment that could interfere with the growth of corals. So coralline algae is another important part of reef building. Put this back up here. Then the last things that I will mention are shells. So you get shells of like mollusks, sponges, starfish, and well, what does this do? Well, these dead parts of these organisms, they get added to the sediment. And so if you end up with, so you get the sediment, then the algae surrounds it, and so that's going to add to the growth of the reef. So let me show you a picture here. So here's the coralline algae that I showed you, or that I talked about. And so basically, if the dead remains of mollusk and sponges and starfish are on the sediment, and then it gets surrounded by this algae, that's just going to add to the growth of the reef. Okay, so those are the reef builders. Let's talk now about how the reef is formed and how it grows. So coral is part of phylum Cnidaria. So it's in the same phylum as jellyfish. And it is part of class Anthozoa. And then within these two classes, there are two subclasses. The first is called subclass Halcynaria, And then the second one is subclass Zoantharia. Okay, so in this subclass, Alcyonaria, this is more of your soft corals. So in other words, they don't produce the calcium carbonate. And then over here, this is more of the hard coral, or what is called stony coral. Sea anemones are also part of this. So usually when the kind of coral that produces the reef structure is the stony coral. So that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the type of coral that produces the reef. Okay, so that's important. The stony coral produces the reef. Okay, so let's take a look then at a picture of, well, first of all, this is just going to show you some of the types of soft coral. So these are the types of coral that do not produce the reef. And then this is a schematic or a drawing of the stony coral. And so a couple things that I want to point out to you about the stony coral. So it consists of a tiny polyp with these tentacles at the top. Okay, so here's our tentacles that are at the top. Typically, there are 6 tentacles for this particular the stony coral. And what the tentacles do is that they capture the food. So tentacles capture food, and then that food gets directed down into the gut cavity, which is there. Maybe I should change my color there. Okay, so the food gets directed down into the gut cavity. The other thing about the tentacles is that they have these nematocysts, which you might remember from biology, but nematocysts are they are structures that release a toxin that will stun or paralyze their prey. So in the figure that we looked at, we can see those, at least where the nematocysts would be present on the tentacles. Coral live in colonies, so that means they live next to each other. And the other thing that I want you to see is that the coral polyp sits inside a calcium skeleton, which is called a corallite. So let me write that up for you. So there is a corallite is it's like a calcium skeleton that the polyp sits inside. And then there are septa. Septa means anytime you see the word septa or septum, that means a wall. So these are like these sharp ridges from the center. And then the other, we'll look at a picture in just a moment. The other thing is the columella, which are these projections that come up from the floor. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at that picture then. Okay, so I mentioned the coralline. So this coral polyp sits within this skeleton that is called a coralline, and then we have these septa here that are kind of like walls on the outside, and then we have these columella that are they're the projections that come off of the bottom or the floor of the polyp. So when the coral grows, they can reproduce asexually several different ways, and they can also reproduce sexually. So let's look. The first thing I want to look at is one way that they can grow. So one of the things that can happen is the coral polyp can lift itself up and it can secrete a new bottom. Then the sides of the top grow by secreting more calcium chloride. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of that, but basically this whole thing can just, the polyp can lift itself up, and then it secretes a new bottom, and then then it'll grow the sides will grow higher, and that grows higher by secreting more calcium chloride, and so you're going to get growth of the coral like that. Another way that they can reproduce is by budding, and we talked about budding in regard to jellyfish, but coral can also bud. So basically, a part pinches off, and then a new part, that part that pinches off is called a bud. And then a new cup grows around that bud. So they can bud in that way. And the other thing I want to show you is that we see this structure right here. That is called a centosarc right here. So that contributes to sideward growth. So they can put out projections or polyps, projections from a polyp in a horizontal way, so that they can connect with the adjacent coral. So this is living tissue that exists between two adjacent corals. So let me put that word up there. So centosarc. So these are like sideways growth. To connect to an adjacent polyp. So that obviously is also going to contribute to the growth of a coral reef as you get those extensions sent out in a horizontal way. Okay, another way that reproduction or growth can happen is that if a piece gets broken off, if a piece of coral gets broken off, then if it's any living fragments can grow and form a new colony. So if that piece gets broken off and there's any life, any part of it that's living, that can grow into a new colony. So in some ways that is like regeneration. Okay, and then lastly, they can reproduce sexually. So some types of coral produce both eggs and sperm, but others have separate sexes. And we looked at this when we did jellyfish, but so the egg and sperm, how, whether they are from the same organism or, whether the eggs and sperm have to meet up for fertilization. And then you may remember from the jellyfish, a similar thing happens here where you get the planula formed, and then that planula will settle to the bottom. They'll settle onto the bottom, especially onto rock. And when it does that, then it's called a polyp. P-O-Y. Oh. And then that polyp will continue to reproduce. New calcium carbonate gets added to the old layers. And then you can layer on non-living calcium carbonate with the living tissue, and you get the growth of a reef. There are a lot of different varieties of coral growth formations, and it really depends on whether they bud horizontally, do they bud vertically, do some of them bud in a combination of both. So you get different formations depending on those factors, and it's also affected by like what elements they get exposed to, how deep is the water, what animals eat the coral, are there bacteria and fungus that grow there, are there dead remains of other organisms. So there's a lot of factors that help to determine what type of coral reef formation will be present or will grow. Let me go back to mentioning that symbiotic relationship that we talked about between zooxanthellae and coral. So basically, this organism does photosynthesis, And by doing that, it provides nutrients to the coral. And then, of course, because of photosynthesis is happening, that means that carbon dioxide levels will decrease. And when those CO2 levels decrease, that actually helps the carbonates that are involved in the formation of calcium carbonate, which is the hard structure of a coral reef. So then the calcium carbonate thing can then be built as a protection around it. So it provides nutrients, but it also affects the CO2 levels, which in turn helps the calcium carbonate. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about different types of reefs. Okay, so we are going to talk about three main types of coral reefs. The first one is called a fringing reef. And a fringing reef forms along a coast and in order to form, there needs to be a hard substrate that larvae can settle on. And then that it can grow on. So, and also, because they're near the shore, they can also be affected by sediment and by runoff. So let me show you a picture of so here's a picture of a fringing reef that is, this one is in Papua New Guinea. Another area where there are some fringing reefs is around the Red Sea. There's a fringing reef there that's about 250 miles across. So let's look at, so these are the different regions of a fringing reef. So the area closest to the shore, right here, so the closest to the shore would be the reef flat. Okay, so all this area here that's close to the shore is called a reef flat. So some of this reef flat, it's possible that it could be exposed during low tide. And in here, you're not going to see a lot of diversity here because, you know, there's going to be exposure to air, there's going to be sediment, there's going to be runoff. And so not as much diversity of coral in that area. Okay, then we get the reef crest, and the reef crest is where it begins to slope down, and this is where most of the growth occurs. So at the reef crest is where you would get most of the growth of the coral occurring. Why? Well, there's plenty of light, there's plenty of plankton, and you're still getting some wave action that would help to clear away some of the soft sediment. Soft sediment can sometimes interfere with the growth of a reef, so the waves will clear away some of that soft sediment. So those characteristics help to make the reef crest the area where most of the growth of a coral reef will take place, or a fringing reef will take place. And then we have this steep slope that goes down toward the bottom. And that's called the reef slope. And in this reef slope, there would tend to be more growth up at the top. So reef slope, more growth at the top of the slope. And you would get less growth lower, because you're going to get, so the farther down here, you're going to get less light, right? So there less light as you go down means that you would get less growth of the reef as you get lower. And then at the very bottom, you're going to get this rubble, and that, I mean, it literally is what it means. It's trash. It's like where you get a buildup of like sediment and other, like the remains of dead organisms that just accumulate down there, and that would be the reef rubble. Okay, so those are the main parts of a fringe reef that you should be aware of and know which areas where you would see the most growth and why. Okay, so that is a fringing reef. The second type of reef that we will discuss then is a barrier reef. And you've probably heard of a barrier reef. A barrier reef is farther offshore and there is a lagoon between the shoreline and the reef. So what is a lagoon? Well, a lagoon is a calm area. So the lagoon helps to shield. Okay, so a lagoon is a calm area. That shields the reef from waves. The lagoon often will have a soft bottom, so a lot of times you'll see a lot of seagrasses growing in a lagoon. So one of the big types of barrier reefs is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and parts of that reef are 1,200 miles across. So a very large and well-known barrier reef, and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is actually comprised of just thousands of smaller reefs that combine to form this very large reef. So let's look at, so here's a part of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And then let's go ahead and look at the parts of a barrier reef. Okay, so I mentioned to you, so you're going to get the so here's the shore over here. Okay, so here's the shore, and then you're going to get this lagoon in between the shore and the reef. So this is going to, that calm area between the two. And then you have the back reef slope, and you have the front reef slope. So the back reef slope is the part that slopes up from the lagoon, up to the reef flat. Okay, so this area here is called the reef flat. So the back part slopes up, then you have the flat, and then sloping down, you would have the front reef slope, or the fore reef slope. The best coral growth for this type of reef will occur here at this reef crest. So right here is where you would get the best growth of coral. And you should be able to say now why that is the case, because there's going to be plenty of nutrients and plenty of light so that you can get the growth, and you're getting the protection from waves because of this calm area. And sometimes what will happen around these barrier reefs is you'll get a sand buildup, and you actually get a small key. We call them keys in the United States. Other parts of the world call them a K, but you'll get this area sticking up here. So the best growth will occur at the reef crest, and then as here for the fore reef slope, this area that comes down, you'll get some growth up here at the top, but further down you're not going to get as much growth. There are some types of coral that will grow down here, but there'll be less growth of coral down there in the fore reef slope area. Okay, so that is the barrier reef. The last type of reef that we will talk about is called an atoll. And what an atoll is, it is a ring of coral, and there are steep outer slopes with a lagoon in the middle. And the atolls are more common in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and they are generally far from land. And they tend to be in areas of deeper water. So these atolls can be found where the water depth around them can be hundreds or even thousands of feet deep. So let's look at a picture of one before we talk about them a little bit. Okay, so here are these are pictures in the Indian Ocean, and these are taken, these are aerial shots of atolls in the Indian Ocean. So you can see these rings of coral that surround a lagoon, and they tend to be in very deep water. Well, where do these come from? How is it? Remember, we said that coral needs a hard surface to grow on, and generally they need a lot of light. So it has kind of baffled scientists as to how these form. Well, Darwin, and this is one thing, this is a thing that Darwin, it seems at least, had right. He felt that a fringing reef, a barrier reef, and an atoll were all just different stages of the same reef. So that a reef would start out as a fringing reef, it become a barrier reef, and then become an atoll. And what most scientists believe now is that when a volcano erupts over the years, then lava builds up, and that lava will eventually build up to the point of rising above the surface, and then you have an island. So then if coral larvae settle on it, then it'll grow near the surface, and you have a fringing reef. And that reef will continue to grow, and as it grows, some of the coral will break off and new coral will grow, and eventually the weight of that coral reef, as well as the fact that the volcano that's no longer erupting will become cooled, then what will happen is that island will actually sink. And as it sinks, and it'll continue to build up, then you get a barrier reef. And then if that island continues to sink and it gets completely submerged, and then the coral would grow on top of it, and the coral that has been growing the longest would grow around the edge. So then you end up with this lagoon in the middle, and then it's an atoll. So that's the best explanation that scientists have of about how an atoll forms. Scientists actually, coral grows pretty slowly, and scientists actually will sometimes help out the growth by sinking ships or cars or something like that to give the coral something to grow on. And in our previous explanation, the volcanic material that hardens and then sinks could be that something for coral to grow on. Sometimes the debris from a storm will also provide a hard substrate for coral to grow on. Okay, let's look at we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but this one we will. Okay, so here is an atoll. So we have our 4 reef slope. Okay, so that's going to be the 4 reef slope is that which goes up and down, and then you have the lagoon in the middle, and then the back reef slope would be here and here. Okay, so 4 reef slope, back reef slope, 4 reef slope, back reef slope with the lagoon in the middle, and then sometimes you'll get these pillars of coral that grow up into the lagoon that are called pinnacles. And then I mentioned previously that sometimes you'll get these sand accumulations of sand around here that will rise up above the lagoon. And these are like in the Florida Keys or other parts of the world, they call them sand cays. Okay, so that is the different types of reefs that we will talk about. So there's the fringing reef, the barrier reefs, and an atoll. Okay, now let's we just have a few minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about the ecology of a coral reef. Remember, ecology is how do organisms and their surroundings and environment interact with each other? So how do the thousands of organisms that live on a reef affect each other? Okay, so we already mentioned the zooxanthellae. And we mentioned they do photosynthesis. They also can take the organic material that the coral can use, or they can take the waste from the coral. So they take the waste from the coral and convert it into organic material that the coral can use. So this is kind of like the ultimate recycling plant. So they recycle the waste from the coral, and then the coral is able to reuse that. And then we also mentioned that they reduce the CO2 levels. And by reducing the CO2 levels, that actually helps in the formation of the calcium carbonate. So, as we've said, I think this is the third time we've mentioned that these zooxanthellae are really important for the survival of and growth of a reef. Another something that we've talked about before, but let's talk about how it relates to a reef. So remember that we talked about nitrogen fixation, and that is taking nitrogen gas and changing it into nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. So remember we said that nitrogen gas cannot, as nitrogen gas, it can't be used it can't be used as organic material for organisms, but these organisms need nitrogen to do things like DNA, RNA, proteins. And so nitrogen fixation is taking that nitrogen gas, converting it into one of these forms. Well, there are, living on a reef, there are bacteria. And the bacteria on the reef do nitrogen fixation. So that those bacteria do nitrogen fixation. So those bacteria serve an important role on the reef. Another way in terms of recycling. So one fish will feed on coral. And then the fish will eliminate waste. And And then guess what? The coral will use that waste for nutrients. So the fish eat the coral then eliminate the waste products of the coral that they've eaten, and then the coral will use that waste. So again, very excellent recycling system around a coral reef. As you can imagine, there is some competition among organisms around on a coral reef. So one thing that they will compete for available space. There are some types of coral that can send out filaments from their guts, from their gut or stomach, and they can digest adjacent coral. So that's one aspect of competition that you will see. As we mentioned before, some types of coral have stinging tentacles. So they will use those stinging tentacles to sting adjacent coral. So that's one way that one type of coral can dominate a given area. Another thing that can, in terms of competition, some coral will grow faster than others. So some coral will have rapid growth, and they can grow so rapidly that they block the sunlight for other colonies. And so that also, again, is going to be a way that they can help to dominate a particular area. Okay, so there is competition. As we see in other ecosystems, there can be competition among organisms. As I mentioned earlier, that around some areas of reefs, you can get seaweed growing. Now remember, seaweed is an algae. The seaweed can grow rapidly under certain conditions. The seaweed can grow very rapidly. However, the fish living around a reef eat a lot of it, and so even though under certain conditions you can get a lot of seaweed growing, it doesn't overtake the area and it doesn't kill the coral, because the fish living in the area will tend, they just eat a lot of it, so it tends to keep it from overtaking and killing the coral, even though a lot of algae might be being produced. Let me mention just a few more things. Let me say just a few more things about fish on a coral reef. So fish do they bite off random chunks of a reef. So they don't feed on the whole reef, they just take off these random chunks, and then the parts that are eaten can grow back. And then if a fish feeds on algae or seagrasses, then they also feed on these small areas, and that can regrow. And then the fish may also they'll eat things like mollusks, they'll eat crustaceans, etc. And then guess what? They eliminate waste. So the fish eat that, and they eliminate waste. And that waste can then be used to feed the reef. So in that way, the mollusk and the crustaceans, the substances within those end up feeding the reef because the fish eat them and eliminate waste, and then that provides nutrients for the reef. We've already talked a little bit about different types. We talked about the symbiosis with the zooxanthellae, but there are lots of examples of symbiosis around coral reefs. I just want to mention one. Your book mentions others, but you can read about those in your book. But one that I'll mention is a shark and remora. So there are sharks are pretty messy eaters. So what the remora does, the remora will they have suction cups, and they will attach themselves to the dorsal fins of a shark. And as I said, sharks are, when they eat, they drop a lot of scraps, and then the remora will eat those scraps that the shark drops. So that's the way that the remora benefits from that relationship. But how does the shark benefit? Well, the other thing that the remora will do is it will eat the parasites that are growing on the shark. So the remora benefits by eating the food that the shark drops, and the shark benefits because the remora will also eat parasites that are living on it. There are other symbiotic relationships that are discussed in your book. We talked a little bit about cleaner fish. So there are types of shrimp that will, there are other organisms that will set up cleaning stations, and organisms will come and clean the teeth of those of the fish, or the fish will come there to get their teeth cleaned. So the organisms get food and the fish get their teeth cleaned. Another one that is kind of interesting is something that is called a crown of thorns sea star. So remember that when we learned about sea stars, we learned that they push their stomach out of their mouth and then they will eat. Well, they can eat. These can eat a lot of coral. So they push their stomach out and they'll eat coral. However, there are other organisms that live on the coral, like crabs and shrimp, and they will fight the coral as they are crawling, as the sea, or they'll fight the sea stars. Other organisms will fight the sea stars. So the sea stars will be eating the coral, but these other organisms, as the sea stars are crawling along the coral, they will fight them, and they'll actually like bite or pinch their tube feet. So then the crown of thorns sea stars will leave. So that helps that relationship between the coral and these other organisms help to prevent the crown of thorns sea star from overeating the coral and completely decimating a particular section of coral reef. So lots of symbiotic relationships within a coral reef. And we are going to stop there for module 11.